Congratulations. You traded the most powerful throne in Mexico for the most scrutinized cage in America. ADX Florence, Colorado, carved into the Rockies like a wound that never heals. The place where the country buries its nightmares so deeply they forget what sunlight looks like. Welcome to your permanent address. A concrete rectangle measuring roughly 7 feet by 12, where the calendar will keep turning until your body finally refuses to cooperate. The morning they flew you north, you were crying. Not the theatrical weeping of someone performing grief for an audience, but the quiet, collapsing tears of a man who has finally absorbed a truth he spent years outrunning. What strikes you first about your cell is not its size, but its honesty. There is no pretense here. No architectural suggestion that comfort was ever a consideration. Concrete walls painted the specific shade of white that exists nowhere in nature, a color engineered to remind you that every surface surrounding you was a decision someone made about you, without you, before you arrived. A steel sleeping platform, a sink and toilet fused into a single brushed metal unit with no angles sharp enough to be repurposed. A ceiling slit that emits a ribbon of Colorado light that tells you nothing about what hour it is or what season is passing outside. Time stopped being a dimension here. It became a substance instead, thick and pressurized, something you move through rather than something that moves past you. The meals arrive 3 times daily through a slot in the door. Plastic trays that have been x-rayed and chemically analyzed before they reach you, because the government has determined that both poisoning you and freeing you represent unacceptable outcomes. You eat processed food that tastes like institutional policy. And remember, with involuntary precision, the specific gravity of a meal prepared by someone who understood your preferences before you voiced them. That memory is your only remaining luxury. You remember the trial the way you remember a fever, in fragments and intensities rather than sequence. The courtroom had the atmosphere of a museum exhibit, everyone present to observe the documented dismantling of something that had once seemed permanent. Your partner of 2 decades sat in the witness chair and described your operational methods with the precise recall of someone who had been rehearsing for years. Your accountant walked the jury through financial architectures that had taken a decade to construct and required only 4 days to explain to strangers. Your most trusted enforcer enumerated 150 individual operations with the effectless delivery of someone reciting a grocery list. You sat in your cheap suit and understood that loyalty, the thing you had traded your entire life to cultivate, was in fact a commodity with a shelf life, and yours had expired. 10 counts. Guilty on all of them. The judge read the sentence in a voice that suggested she had delivered worse news to people she cared about more. Life plus 30 years, the additional decades, functioning as a mathematical insurance policy against any future legal miracle. You did the arithmetic in real time and arrived at the same answer the prosecutors had intended: 0. You receive 23 hours of cell time daily. The remaining 60 minutes occur in an outdoor enclosure that functions less like recreation and more like the scheduled maintenance of a confined animal. You walk its perimeter in a pattern that has become unconscious, counting footsteps not because the number serves any purpose, but because counting remains the last administrative act still available to you. Guards monitor from elevated positions, carrying equipment typically reserved for military engagements. Not because escape is architecturally possible, but because someone with sufficient resources might attempt a retrieval from above. The protocol is simultaneously absurd and completely sincere, which is the defining characteristic of everything in this institution. Outside this building, the infrastructure you built continued operating without requiring your signature on anything. Someone younger stepped into the space your absence created, and the product kept moving north through the same corridors you had spent 30 years engineering. Your lawyers delivered this information as though it might be neutral, but it landed as the confirmation that the empire had never actually been yours, that you had been the most prominent employee of a system that predated you and would outlast every version of your replacement. You constructed an identity around being irreplaceable, and the organization held a brief, efficient memorial and then promoted from within. The guards rotate every 7 days by institutional design. Familiarity is classified as a security vulnerability here, human connection reframed as structural weakness. Each new rotation brings faces that process you the same way, a compound expression you have cataloged with the thoroughness of a man with nothing else to study. Professional neutrality, layered over the specific curiosity that attaches to famous catastrophes. You are not a person to these men in any operational sense. You are an assignment with a number, 8991-42053, a biological object requiring maintenance, feeding, monitoring, and containment. They do not hate you. Hatred would require them to see you, and their training has made you invisible in the most efficient way possible by making you categorical. You develop a physical discipline not from ambition, but from necessity. The body becomes the last jurisdiction where your authority remains intact. 500 push-ups at dawn, each one a private referendum on whether you still exist in any meaningful sense. At your age, in the mountains where you once moved for weeks without rest, this would have seemed like maintenance for the elderly. Here, it is the only form of governance left to you, the sole remaining territory where your decisions produce immediate and predictable results. Each repetition is addressed to a specific person, the politicians who accepted your payments and then accepted immunity with equal efficiency. The associates who calculated that testimony was more economical than loyalty. You work through the full accounting every morning, and it takes approximately the same number of repetitions each time, which tells you something about the consistency of betrayal as a human institution. Your mind has begun doing something the clinical staff calls temporal disintegration, and that you experience as the slow dissolution of sequence. Events that happened a decade ago arrive with the sensory vividness of yesterday. Things that occurred last month feel archaeological. You forget names that you once knew, the way you know your own breathing. Names of men who reported to you, who feared you, who built things at your direction. The prison psychologists note this in their reports with professional detachment. You note it with the specific terror of someone watching themselves disappear from the inside. The gradual subtraction of the person you were until what remains is an outline, a shape where a man used to be. The letters reach you as documents of erasure. Your daughter wrote about something important in her life, and you received a page that was more black ink than words. The censors having determined that her pride constituted a potential security event. The photograph she attached was removed entirely before the envelope reached your slot. Your lawyers send correspondence that both parties understand to be procedural theater. Every envelope takes 3 weeks to arrive and arrives already diminished, passing through forensic analysis and security review before it reaches your hands, emerging from the process technically intact and fundamentally altered. The 2 telephone calls permitted monthly have compressed into exercises in deliberate meaninglessness. Every word passes through bilingual monitoring, every unusual phrase triggers review, so the conversations contract around the safest possible content. You and the person on the other end both understand the performance you are jointly delivering. You deliver it anyway because the alternative is silence, and you have enough silence to last several lifetimes. Your wife appeared twice. The first visit she spent in visible grief that your presence intensified rather than relieved. The second time, she brought your youngest daughter, and you watched the child examine you the way children examine strangers, without recognition, without the warmth you had assumed would survive your absence. You had lost weight and color and some essential quality of presence that children detect before adults do. Your wife did not schedule a third visit, and you have arrived at a place of understanding about that decision that resembles acceptance without quite achieving it. There was a period when your son's name appeared in the weekly news summary they permit you. Then the headlines changed in the way you had always known they eventually would. He is somewhere in this same building now, 200 meters away, through walls and checkpoints and institutional geometry that might as well be the distance between planets. You will not see him. You cannot reach him. The only thing connecting you is the decision you made decades ago to bring him into a life that had only one possible terminal destination. That knowledge does not leave, it does not soften with time. It sits in the center of your chest like a stone that arrived the day they confirmed his location and has not shifted since. Your health declines on a schedule that the medical staff monitors with the interest of engineers tracking aging equipment, diabetes, hypertension. The accumulated structural damage of years spent sleeping on cave floors while half the country's security apparatus searched for you. They prescribe medications that sustain your functionality at the level required to complete your sentence. They are not treating you. They are preserving the government's exhibit. Your body is evidence that the system works, and evidence must be maintained. You think sometimes about the tunnel, 1.5 kilometers of excavated precision beneath a maximum security facility, ventilated and illuminated and equipped with a motorcycle on a custom rail system, executed over months by rotating crews working around the clock. 13 minutes from the cell floor to open air, your personal masterwork. You now occupy a structure whose designers studied that tunnel specifically before pouring a single yard of concrete. The floor beneath you is reinforced to a depth that will require years to breach. Every fastener in this building has been welded rather than threaded. You are the reason certain architectural decisions were made, which is the only form of legacy this institution permits you. The famous details of your life circulate beyond these walls, in forms you cannot access and would not recognize. Corridos, murals. Children in Sinaloa adopting your name for games whose rules they don't yet understand. Guards occasionally mention these things, and you cannot always determine whether they intend cruelty or simply lack the imagination to recognize what they are describing. The mythology has completed its separation from the man who generated it. Out there, you are a story. In here, you are a number, consuming resources. Both versions have lost interest in the actual person who connects them. Some nights, when the ventilation system drops to its lowest register and the guard rotations align to produce an unusual interval of quiet, you find yourself doing an accounting that has nothing to do with money or logistics. You count the people whose removal you authorized. Not the abstract total that prosecutors cited, but the specific ones. The faces that arrive unbidden when your defenses are lowest: competitors and witnesses and journalists and officers, and people who are simply present at the wrong intersection of your convenience and their vulnerability. You lost the precise count years ago. What remains is not guilt in any form you were raised to recognize, but something more structural, a permanent weight distributed evenly through everything you are, the cost of the inventory finally coming due in a place with no distractions and no mechanism for converting regret into something actionable. When the ventilation generates its low mechanical frequency, you close your eyes and perform a translation your mind has learned to execute automatically. The sound becomes wind descending through the Sierra where you were 9 years old and had not yet made any of the decisions that produced this room. You were a child in a landscape that had never heard your name, with a future that remained genuinely unwritten. You stay in that place as long as the translation holds. Eventually, the machinery reasserts itself, and you are here again, fully and inescapably here, an old man in a room the size of a parking space, who has memorized every imperfection in the ceiling above him. This is what remains when you strip away the empire, the reputation, the family, the fortune, the mythology, and the freedom. A man in his 70s, fluent in the architecture of his own ruin, watching his body complete its long resignation, waiting not with hope or despair, but with the flat patience of someone who has finally run out of alternatives. You were the most wanted man on 2 continents. You were the subject of task forces and extradition negotiations that consumed years and careers across multiple governments. And now you are a maintenance problem, a number on a roster, a cautionary exhibit that the institution tends carefully because your survival is the only remaining argument it has left to make about itself. The king is still here. The kingdom has been running without him. The throne was never really his. And the morning comes again, the same as every morning, and the ceiling has exactly the same number of cracks it had yesterday, and the count is the only number left that belongs entirely to you.